a lot of argument online recently about how to bring an army list for Warhammer 40,000. Should it be balanced? Should it be skewed? How do you build it? All those things. Well, I've actually made one of the best guides possible for how to build an army list. But let's talk about, should it be balanced and should it be skewed? So we're going to break that down in today's video. Balanced versus skewed. First, let's get some definitions out of the way. What do I mean by a balanced list? Well, a balanced list is one that is going to be an all-comers. So if you were to go to a GT, a grand tournament, 5 rounds, or even RTT, 3 rounds, doesn't matter. You're going to be fairly comfortable playing into more or less any army that you come across. Yeah, there's always going to be some matchups that are better. There's always going to be some matchups that are a little bit worse. But you've got a game plan of how you're going to pivot into a very uppy downy army. So like, deep strike heavy. You've got ways that you're going to go if you're playing into an army that has lots of hordes or lots of tanks. It doesn't really matter. You've got a plan for basically everything. Then a skew list is going to be a list that doesn't really plan for playing against everything. Instead, the skew list creates a problem for your opponents to deal with. This would be something like a list that is all tanks, chaos knights, imperial knights, things like this, just massive monsters. Or on the flip side, you can be things like pure hordes. So no vehicles, just tons and tons of bodies. Can you deal with 160 bodies on the table? Both of these are really good questions, and it really helps to clarify the difference between the two really list designs. So should you make all comers? Should you plan for the problems that you're going to face? Meaning, should you plan for the meta armies? Like, if you know the best army in the game right now is Eldar, should you tech to play against Eldar? Should you build as you are a problem for other armies? Like, lots of people are taking anti-tank. Does that mean that you take horde? Should you make lists that is agnostic of your opponents, meaning like you don't care who your opponent is, your list is going to play the exact same way? Well, we're going to break all of that down. So let's hop right into it. So what is the list that you are building for? Are you building it for a grand tournament, which would be like 2 days, 5 rounds? Are you planning it for a super major, which very well could be 3 days, 8 rounds? Could be more or less by a few. Are you building it for a local RTT? How about an online TTS league? Well, are you building it on WTC terrain, GW terrain, UKTC terrain? Because here's the deal, everybody. This will change what style list you're going to build a lot of times. Does the layout allow for skewed list? Like, let's say you have a layout, but it's buildings absolutely everywhere. It means that getting lines of sight can be quite difficult. This would be one of the times where you might not want to build a tank-heavy skew because it's going to be really hard for you to move up the table. Let's say the map is wide open, like it might be on a UKTC terrain layout. This might not be the correct time to be building a melee skewed list. Simply because it's going to be really hard to get your models to the enemy before you get obliterated. So whether you're playing at a GT, a Super Major, an RTT, and the terrain, that will really decide what style, well, at least it will influence what style army you're going to play. If you're playing at a GT for 5 rounds, maybe bringing a heavily skewed list might be a very good idea because you only have 5 rounds. The likelihood that you run into one of the few armies that might counter you hard could be pretty low. However, when you go to something like a super major, you've got 8 rounds, maybe a more balanced list might be a better approach because it's going to be more likely that you're going to run into one of the armies that counters your skew, right? So it can change based off all that. Now let's talk about the virtues of a balanced list. What makes a balanced list good? Well, number one, adaptability. Balanced list gets to handle lots of different threats, and it makes it super effective against a variety of archetypes. Whether you're playing into horde, elite infantry, shooting armies, melee armies, it doesn't matter because you're going to have an answer to each one of these little answers. There's an easier barrier to entry. You're not particularly punished on any of the terrain layouts. So whether you're not really sure how to build your army specifically for Games Workshop versus WTC versus UKTC, well, the reality is you've got like units that can kind of do everything in every different area, so you're not going to be super punished for playing on unfamiliar terrain. You've got fewer bad matchups. When you've got this well-rounded force, it's going to be harder for certain armies to be very really good into because, well, let's say it's an uppy downy army and you're playing Space Marines. You'll probably have 1 unit of infiltrators now, which makes it so it's hard for them to really maximize their uppy downy ability. At the same time, maybe you have a Land Raider, which makes it pretty hard for people to pop your transport before your melee gets into combat. At the same time, you still have combat coming out of the Land Raiders. You're pretty balanced, so people have to be careful where they're staging their models, right? So it makes it so that you're going to have less bad matchups. It also makes it that you're going to have, less good matchups, mind you. You're also going to allow for more consistent performance because balanced lists are generally going to be more reliable across multiple rounds of a tournament, ensuring steady results. And the reason why for this is there's a huge difference in how you have to approach a purge the foe battle versus how you're going to approach a linchpin battle versus how you're going to approach a supply battle. But these more balanced lists take all of this into account because you know you're going to run into purge the foe. You know you might run into terraform. So you're going to have answers for all of those individual styles or primaries. So you're going to have probably more consistent performance. And it's also just going to end typically going to be more forgiving for mistakes because you're going to have multiple tools that can kind of back each other up. So if you have a melee unit that gets killed, well, there's going to be low probability that you only had one melee unit, right? Or if you have one shooting unit that gets killed, you're not really a skew list, so you probably have more than just one shooting unit. So there's going to be some redundancy that can help you survive certain mistakes that you may make. Now, what are some of the negatives of balanced list? Well, lack of specialization, because since balanced lists kind of do a little bit of everything, that means you're probably not going to be the best at everything. So you're going to be struggling into some of these more skewed lists that might be fully committing to a particular strength. So if you have an army that is just a brutal gun line and it has everything deployed on the line and you only have, say, 2 or 3 decent shooting units, that could be very troublesome for you because if you want to put your shooting units out, you know you can't really put too much of a dent into him, but they might wipe your entire army in one go, right? So the lack of specialization can be a bit of an issue. It can also be easy to plan for these balanced lists. Opponents know what they're going to need to expect, and they're going to have good ideas of how to counter your army. Simply because you're going to have a variety of units that are going to be there for each individual scenario, it means that you're not going to provide any particular problem for your opponent. Now, this is not hard and fast. Of course, balanced lists can provide problems for people, right? You can have a balanced Votan list that causes problems for your opponents. But we're talking in more general terms here. It's going to be easier for your opponent to basically understand what your list is designed to do, and so they're going to be able to come up with a counter probably a little more easily than if you were into a hyper skewed approach. You're also going to have slower, grindier games. You're going to lack some of the explosiveness to end games quickly. What this means is that it could be a little bit more fatiguing to play because if you have to go 5 rounds for every single game and you end up winning by 5 points, this can cause a lot of fatigue over the course of a weekend at a tournament. And then lastly, it can be harder to exploit meta weaknesses. So what I wrote here is unlike a skewed list that can fully counter known meta trends, a balanced list spreads its bets and might not be able to fully punish weaknesses. So if you know for a fact that Eldar are the new hotness, or GSC is the new hotness, and that there's just going to be tons of T3 bodies out there, and you only have a little bit of anti-T3 shooting or anti-T3 melee, that might actually make it very hard for you to really exploit the fact that there's going to be just tons of T3 bodies in the armies in the tournament. So you might want to plan for this a little bit. And mind you, there can be a balance between a skew and balanced list. Hilariously, there's a balance between a balanced and a skewed list. Sounds funny, but it's also pretty darn true. So you don't have to go full skew, but sometimes leaning a little heavier into skew can be helpful. Now let's talk about the virtues of said skew list. We've talked about some of the virtues of balance and some of the negatives of balance. We're going to do the same for skew list. Skew list, and remember, skew list is like understanding that your army might have glaring weaknesses, but you've got such strong strengths, it probably makes up for the glaring weaknesses that you might have. So you're going to overwhelm opponents with a skew list. Hyper-focused list, we're talking you're 100% melee or 95% melee or something. You're all tank, you're all horde. You get to push a strength so hard that a bunch of armies simply aren't going to be able to deal with it. I'll give you a good example of this is, say you're playing a Green Tide Orcs army. You can legit put 120 orc bodies on the table for not that many points and then still have more left over. There are plenty of armies out there that just can't kill 120 orc bodies, and if they don't have the ability to clear through hordes, sometimes you can just auto win because they literally just can't kill that many bodies. And that's an issue. So your skew lists create problems, and this is something that I like to build. I tend to build skew list myself because one of the things that I find is when I'm playing into armies, I have to identify what problems those armies present, and I have to solve those problems playing Warhammer. But for me, my personal way of playing is I like to become the problem. So yes, I understand you've got certain problems I can't deal with. Like I can't deal with your speed, or I can't deal with you shoot crazy hard. There's nothing I can do about that. But I'm going to present an even bigger problem to you. And that is, if you want to take the line to actually shoot me, it's going to force you to get within like melee range of me, for example. So then I'm going to be able to wipe your entire army with melee in a turn. Something like that, right? So you get to become the problem when you build skew list, rather than just trying to solve the problems of other armies. That doesn't mean balanced armies can't present problems. It's just easier to become the problem when you are a skew list. You also get to exploit the meta a lot more. So if you know, for example, that you're playing and the meta is heavy with GSC and elves, like we were using the example from earlier, it might make sense to just have a ton of, anti toughness 3 shooting. Like, if you have 3 units of 3 mortars for guard, for example, that's a problem for elves. If you have the versus GSC, that can be a problem versus GSC, especially if you have ways to get rerolls. So building skews you can skew specifically towards the big meta threats, what are going to be the most threatening armies that are out there. And if you guys don't know what I mean by the term meta literally translates or literally stands for most effective tactics available. It's not really true. It's basically what it means is it's a popular style of army, popular style of list that tends to be doing well at multiple tournaments right now. And so you can kind of feel out what is popular out in the ether or within your local area, and you can build to counter that. And skew lists are really good at that. And then lastly, a lot of times your skew lists are going to have faster, more streamlined play because your army sometimes will focus a more singular focused game plan. Makes decisions simpler. Not necessarily easier, mind you, because easy and simple are not the same thing. For those of you who think that easy and simple are the same thing, here you go. Is deadlifting 500 kilos easy? No, but it's simple as hell. You bend down, pick it up. But there's only like 2 people alive who can actually do it. So simple and easy aren't the same thing, right? And that's true for Warhammer as well. You can have a very simple game plan that can be very hard to follow. But since you're generally following these simpler, more game plans, it can be more efficient, and you can just be faster to play, which really can reduce mental fatigue, which I find very gratifying when I'm playing at a tournament with a bunch of rounds. Now let's talk about some of the weaknesses of skew list, and then we'll wrap it all together, okay? So there's negatives with your skew list as well. You can have very hard counters. So if I am playing an all-tank army, and I happen to run into a army that has tons of anti-tank shooting, that could be a huge freaking problem. If I'm running nothing but hordes, if I have 120 orc bodies on there and I run into a army that has 3 gladiator reapers, I could be screwed by that. So screwed, in fact, that I might not even be able to have any realistic way of winning that game. Now, if you've listened to some of my other videos, you'll find that there's always a way to win a game, but just for the sake of conversation in this video, that's how I'm going to phrase it. Now, you can also, one of the problems with building these skew lists is high risk, high reward style of play. They often lead to extreme results. So you're either going to dominate or you're going to get crushed in another. And that can actually really make your tournament results fairly inconsistent. Now, for me, I don't find this to be a problem, but I definitely have seen that be a problem for other people. So I want to be out there. So I wanted to present that to you guys as a potential problem with a skew list. You can also be much more vulnerable to dice variance. So if your list is designed to, no matter what, I'm going to be in position and I'm going to charge turn 2, and you fail those charges in turn 2, you can just lose the darn game. So it can make you much more vulnerable to these dice variations. So if your skew list has to perform in the melee phase because you have no shooting and you just whiff in the melee phase, well, then you have no shooting phase to kind of like soften the blow, right? So yeah, we don't like being vulnerable to dice variation. And then lastly, you can be less tactical flexibility. You tend to be forced into more of a specific playstyle when you're building these skewed lists, which can leave very small amounts of wiggle room to adapt when things just aren't going your way. So that's another potential weakness of the skew list. Now let's wrap this all together and figure out, like, when should you build one, when should you build the other? Well, what is the correct way to build our list? Well, the first thing that I have to say, if you are a new or an intermediate level player, I'm going to highly recommend that you stick to more balanced style of lists. They are a little bit more forgiving, and they're going to be generally good on any deployment, on any freaking layout, on any mission that you may be playing against most enemy armies. So that's going to be the correct way to do it. This does not mean that if you're more experienced, you should be playing skew. That is not what I'm saying. I am saying that you shouldn't play skew unless you are more experienced, because you're going to have to understand specifically how your army addresses some of the scenarios that you might otherwise really suck into, for lack of a better term. At GTs, I tend to think that skew lists get rewarded quite a bit. At super majors, I tend to see skew lists get punished quite a bit. The question is, do you want to have answers to the problem your opponent is bringing, in which case a balanced list might be the correct answer, or do you want to be the problem that your opponent needs to answer? And if that's the case, I think skew list is more on the radar. So guys, this is what I have to say. Personally, I like playing skew list. When I coach my clients, I will coach them for what works for them, because you got to understand these lists have to work for you. You are the pilot, you are the general. That's all that matters. If these work for you, not if it works for me, not if it works for some other person out there. It just doesn't matter. It's what works for you. Hopefully this helps. Guys, use this information, crump your foes, and have a great freaking day. Until next time, crump on. All right, bye-bye.